Hi, it's Ted Patterson at Critical Path Training. I'm going to present a lecture from our course Deep Dive into Power Apps and Flow. This is lecture number 8, the last lecture of the course, Managing Application Lifecycle with Power Apps and Flow. Before we get started, I'd like to just call out a great resource for learning more about Power Apps ALM. There's a white paper by David Yak from Colorado Technology Consultants that really gets into the meat of what I'm going to cover here. So this is a great follow-up if you are interested in the material in this lecture and want to kind of get down to the next level. It's a great white paper. Now, what we're going to talk about in today's lecture is first a better understanding of what are environments, what's their purpose, how do we create them. We're going to talk about securing environments. We're going to talk about data loss prevention policies or DLP policies. We're going to talk about what we do in the lifetime of a Canvas app and a Flow. So we'll talk about publishing, sharing, versioning. We'll talk about exporting and importing Canvas apps and flows. And then we'll also talk about how to install and configure an on-premises data gateway and how that factors in. Now, as we get to the last section here, and we're going to talk about custom solutions, you're going to find that there is a recommended approach, for really having a structured application lifecycle management policy where we create solutions and we can create what are called managed solutions, which are locked down. And so to be able to produce a set of components and then deploy them, it gives you a lot of capability. The one issue is that custom solutions today work for the CDS database. So if you create an extended standard entity or customized an entity, or if you create a model-driven app, it works for that. It just doesn't work for Power Apps and Flow. So we're going to spend some time talking about custom solutions because it is the future of deploying Canvas apps and flows, but it's not presently what we use. We have to wait a couple more months, but understanding custom solutions, will be important. Okay, so that's our agenda. Let's go ahead and get started. So we talked a little bit about environments in lecture 7. And just to reiterate, what is an environment? It's a container. As you create Power Apps and Flows, as you start customizing the CDS database and create model-driven apps, it's the container where those things are stored in. Now, each environment exists within a geographic region. So one of the things that's nice is when you create an environment, its data residency is established. And we can basically, show whatever parties are interested, some type of proof, that our data lives in a particular location. Okay, now also the environment represents a governance boundary. And so not only is it a governance boundary that allows us to say, what types of connectors are allowed, it also is a security boundary. So we can specify, what users or what Azure Active Directory groups, should have access and what type of access. Now, every time the Microsoft Cloud creates a new Office 365 tenant, or an Azure AD tenant really, it has a default environment. So if you don't want to pay attention to environments, one is automatically created behind the scenes. Now, another important aspect is when a new environment is created, you have the choice of creating it with a CDS for apps database or without a CDS for apps database. And it's not a casual decision because that significantly impacts how we configure security within that environment. Now, another big milestone is that Dynamics 365 has just moved to the same model that we're talking about in this lecture. So as of Dynamics 365 version 9, when you create a new Dynamics 365 instance, they simply create the same type of Power Apps environment with a CDS database, that we're going to be looking at in this lecture. Okay, now let's say I want to manage environments. Now, in the next couple of slides, we're going to look at the licensing and the permissions that you need. You need a combination of licensing and permissions to be able to do this. But given the fact that you have the correct licensing and permissions, not only can you see environments, but you can click the New Environment button and you can create a new environment. And what's very important is when an environment gets created, you have the choice of creating it with a CDS for apps database or without a CDS for apps database. And once again, that's really going to change, significantly how we configure security, as we're going to see, quite shortly. Now, also remember that the fact that every single environment gets created in an environmental region is important. Today we don't really have the option of deciding what regions. Once we have a tenant and our tenant is in a particular region, basically the environments are created, there as well. In the future, what Microsoft wants to be able to offer to customers is the ability for one customer and one tenant to create one region over in the UK and another region on the west coast of California, just to get the data closer to where the users who are accessing it exist. Okay, so when we create an environment, some of the issues to consider is, make sure we create the environment close to where the users are located to reduce, any type, of latency, but also to create environments, in a region, where it's required from a data residency standpoint. Okay, now here's a quick chart that you can reference. So note that if you want to be king of the castle, if you want to be able to do everything with respect to managing licenses, if you are the global admin and you have been given a PowerApps Plan 2 license, you can see that across the top row, you can manage licenses, you have full access to the PowerApps portal, we can manage environments, we have full access to control data loss policies. Okay, now also, you could be in the role of user manager and have a P2 license, and then you can do some but not all. Also recognize that Dynamics 365 has an admin role that you can be in. Okay, and once again, you can see that it's a subset of the permissions you have with global admin and P2. Okay, now also note that in order for anyone to be able to just run a PowerApps Canvas app or to run a flow, you need to have the proper licensing. Now, most users, just to be able to run PowerApps and flows, have their licensing already provided by Office 365 licenses or Dynamics 365 licenses. But if you're going to be creating and managing environments or customizing CDS databases, you need a Plan 2 license. Any time you create a model-driven app or do anything with the CDS and users are going to be accessing an environment with a CDS database, they need a Plan 1 license from PowerApps and Flow. Note that up in the PowerApps Admin Center, you can download user licenses and you can basically see, what users have been accessing it and what licensing they have. Now, let's go through some of the different types of environments. Now, not all these environments are available for you to create directly, inside of your Office 365 trial, but we kind of classify environments a certain way. So there's a production environment. And the idea is that the production environment is long-lived. We're going to do permanent work. We might have solutions that we continually upgrade and update over time, but it's basically where the work's going to go on. Now, there's also a default environment. We talked about that, and you can think of it as a special type of production environment. Now, there's also going to be sandbox environments, and the idea is that you have an environment that you can do customizations in, and then there's going to be a way to take a snapshot of your customizations by basically creating a solution. And then you're going to be able to, click a button and reset the environment and put it back to where it was. Okay, so that should be coming online sometime soon. Today we do have trial environments that are available, and the idea of a trial environment is it's not long-lived. So the idea is you have 30 or 60 days once you create the trial environment, and then it stops working. So for short-term testing, you're typically creating trial environments and then getting rid of them. There's also a developer environment. Now, if you have a P2 plan, the PowerApps P2 plan, you can create 2 production environments and 2 trial environments. But let's say you don't want to pay anything, you just want to start developing things. So there's also a community plan that allows you to create a developer environment. And the developer environment allows you, to have a long-lived environment so it doesn't die after a certain amount of time. It allows you to work with the CDS for apps to customize standard entities, to basically create custom entities and build model-driven apps on top of it. And the reason it's free is because it only supports a single user. But you could create development efforts inside of it. You could then export what you've done as a solution and import it, into a production environment. Okay, now I mentioned the developer environment, if you want to create that, you need to sign up for the PowerApps Community Plan. And the idea is that Microsoft would be thrilled to give this to you because it knows that you're going to be starting to build solutions that you want to basically push into real production environments, and that you're going to help making Power Apps and CDS for apps more successful in terms of adoption. Okay, remember a couple slides back, I mentioned that every time we create a new Azure AD tenant, think of it as an Office 365 tenant if you want, we get a default environment. Now, before I jump through this slide, let's go ahead and move back into Power Apps. And if I have enough permissions and I'm running as global admin, I have a Plan 2 license. So if I go to the Admin Center, not only can I see existing environments, I can also create new environments as well. Now, note that if you create an environment and you give it a CDS database, let's go ahead and open up this one right inside here. You can basically see that it gets this unique name. And that's something that's kind of a carryover from Dynamics 365, that their databases, therefore their environments, got unique names. Now, if I open up one that does not have a CDS database behind it, and I open this up, note that, well, we don't really have that same special name. There's the ability to create a database afterwards. Note that if you create a database after the fact, afterwards, it's just like you had created the environment with a database to begin with. As I mentioned, we're going to see that security is going to be different with this type of environment compared to an environment that has a CDS database. And then finally, here's the default. So every time that we create a new tenant and we start working with PowerApps and Flow inside, we're working in the context of this default tenant. So we're able to add security. Notice that they have a database tab here, but it's not really supported yet to create the database inside of the default environment. Okay, back to the slide. Now let's go through these top set of bullet points. Each tenant has a default environment created in the nearest Azure region. The default environment cannot be deleted, cannot be disabled. The environment automatically adds all tenant users to the maker role, which basically means that any user can go there, once again, and every user is going to see the ability to create new apps, start from blank. So what's unfortunate is that if you have the default tenant or any other tenant that doesn't have a CDS database, the user has to be in the maker role. So it doesn't really support this idea of having a consumer who can't create, who can only use, coming to this portal right here. Okay, so that's something where hopefully in the future, we're going to make some improvements upon that. So what is the default environment, about? The default environment, provides self-service app and flow building services to all users. And it might be the place where we allow kind of a more casual team building of Power Apps as opposed to someone who's trying to build and distribute at the enterprise level. Okay, now the default environment does not yet support adding the CDS database. And Microsoft points out that this is something they plan to do. It's just taking them a while to be able to evolve the architecture so they can create the CDS database, inside of the default tenant. Okay, and also one other sticky point, which is something that will go away over time, is the default environment is the only place you can create an on-premises gateway. We're going to talk about the gateway later. Certainly it's going to be nice when you're able to create gateways and use them in other environments, not just the default, but that's not the way it is today. Okay, now let's talk about security roles. If you have an environment that has no CDS database, such as the default environment will always be this way. Okay, back over here, let me go into the Power Apps admin, and notice that if we go to security, we have two different things. We have the admin environment admin and the environment maker inside there. So as far as these particular roles, the environment administrator or the environment admin can basically add and remove users, can create the CDS database instance, and note that creating the CDS database instance will change the existing security model that we're looking at here on the slide. If you are the environment admin, you can view and manage all resources, so you can find and delete or export any Canvas app, any flow, and you can configure data loss prevention policies. If you're an environment maker, you can create and share Canvas apps and flows. You can create and share connections. If you're studly enough, you can create custom connectors as well. Also, the environment makers can create gateways and build connections through those gateways that basically allow us to get to on-prem data sources, such as an on-prem SQL Server database. Now, if you add CDS security roles to the picture, things get a lot more complicated. So, first of all, why would you need CDS security roles? Well, you need an environment with a CDS database. So if you need to, either use or customize standard entities, you need the CDS database. If you need to create custom entities, if you need to configure or change the forms and views behind entities, if you need to create model-driven applications, these are all things that require you're in an environment with a CDS database. Now, when you add the CDS database, the security model changes drastically. And what I mean by that is, if we have an environment and it has no CDS database, then everything is dictated by you either being in the environment admin role or the environment maker role. And then as people create Canvas apps and flows and connections and custom connectors, there are the ability to take those resources and share them with other users or other Azure Active Directory groups. Now, as soon as we add the CDS database, environmental roles no longer matter. That's right. So if you were a maker before, you're nothing. Now, if you were an environment admin and they add the CDS database and the security model changes, what you'll find out is anybody that was an environmental admin is automatically promoted to this new CDS role, which is the system administrator. But what we'll see is that once we have a CDS database, there's no more environmental roles. There's really CDS database roles. And these are carried forward from Dynamics 365. So if you were the environment admin, you're automatically promoted to the system administrator, which is pretty much king of the castle, inside of an environment with a CDS database inside there. So complete ability to customize and administer the environment, full read-write access to all the data inside the database. Now, you can be a system customizer with full permissions to customize the environment, but you can't necessarily see all the data inside there. There's also an environmental maker role that they've added. Note that you're not automatically added inside there, so you have to add someone to the environmental maker role. So what's really nice about having the CDS database roles is that the environment does support this notion of a read-only consumer that doesn't get to build anything. Okay, now there is a role specifically for that, Common Data Service User. So if I make you a Common Data Service User, you have the ability to run the apps that I can create, but you don't have the ability to create your own. Now also, last lecture when we talked about the Common Data Service for apps, and we talked about how you could create custom roles, and you could define exactly what users can do with each of those roles. They can have read-write on account, but only read on contact, something like that. So what's very common is when you're going to create your own custom roles is that you take a copy of the Common Data Service User, and then you customize that for your custom role. Okay, there's one other specialized role called Delegate, which gives you the ability to run something on behalf of a particular user. Okay, now next thing we're going to look at is configuring data loss prevention policies. So let's go ahead and start out by, if I go back here into the Admin Center, and we now look at data policies inside. The idea of a data policy is that you can restrict exactly, which particular connectors can be used in a particular environment. So I'm going to go ahead and click on New Policy. And here, we'll have something apply to all environments, apply to only selected environments. And so what is my selected environment? Let's say we'll put this, in our PowerApps prod. Okay, so now that you have this inside, let's go ahead and continue. And now you have this idea of data groups, and you have connectors that are allowed, called business data only, and you have connectors that are not allowed, no business data allowed, and notice that all connectors are not allowed by default. So we'll go ahead and say add, and now we'll go ahead and say, we want to allow SQL Server to be used inside here. Also, we want to allow SharePoint. And so, now that we have this inside, what is going to be the data policy name? And we'll call this wingtip, prod policy. And now we'll have save and close policy inside here. And so now we basically restricted, what types of connectors and therefore, what type of external data systems we can connect to inside. Okay, back to our slide right here. So data loss prevention is a big thing for many different customers to be able to meet privacy and other types of regulations. So it needs to be available when it's needed, but it needs to be protected so it's not tweeted out by someone and kind of shared with the world. So data loss prevention policies, is what we have to, define these. Okay, so the benefits of a DLP policy, it ensures that, data is managed in a uniform manner. It means we can't just casually call out to any data source that we want. It's also possible to take custom connectors, create connections, and have those be added or prohibited, from your data loss prevention policies as well. Okay, and note that once I configure, what the data loss prevention policies are for a particular environment, and a user does something that violates that, they won't be successful. Instead, they'll get an error, like you see in the slide in front of you. Okay, now we're on to the section where we're going to talk about sharing and versioning Canvas apps and flows. So let's start with just a discussion of the difference between Canvas apps and model-driven apps. So the way that you share is going to differ between which type you've built. And when we say Canvas apps, that also encompasses flows and connections and custom connectors that we've been using all week. And then when we get into model-driven apps, that, along with any customizations you made to the CDS database, are kind of seen as configured separately. So for Canvas apps, we're going to share them with just the users that we have in our Azure Active Directory organization. We can share them with groups. We can share them with the entire organization. When it gets to model-driven apps, the way that you share them is by going to the security configuration for the environment with the CDS roles, and you add them into a role that therefore gives them permissions to get to the model-driven app. Okay, so let's focus on Canvas apps over the next couple slides. Now, if I go to a Canvas app, so for instance, let's say that I'm on as this particular user, and if we go to a particular app, and I take this app and I click on the Share tab, it basically allows me to add new users inside here. For instance, maybe we'll have our friend Jason, and we'll want to add him inside. And so we can basically add a new user, and we can set to either can use or can edit. Okay, now let's say that I've already added two users, Austin and Carrie, and for Austin I've added the can use. So let's go over to a different browser. You can kind of see that over here we're running as Austin. And so if I go into apps, and now we go into org apps, you can see that, here are some apps that have been shared, by this other user with this particular user. Note that the edit button is grayed out. The play button is not. So arguably we could open this up inside here. This user needs to know that he needs to share both with SharePoint and with a camera inside there. And at that point, we can have the user, basically start using the app inside. Also, note that if I go over to Carrie, she's the one who had can edit. So down here, she can go into edit mode and she can continue to help me build the app. Note that only one of us can have the app open in PowerApps Studio at a time. Okay, now let's keep going through here. And let's say that the next thing that we want to look at is you can share Power Apps, and if you have connections behind those, or if you have flows, those are kind of shared in a single, by sharing the Power App, you're inversely sharing the flows and connections. Now, if you want to share a flow with another user, things are different, because when you share a flow, there's not really the can use versus can edit, but to basically share it with another author, you have to make them the owner of the flow. Okay. Now, when you make someone a co-owner, they have the ability to edit the connection. They have the ability to use the connection as is, using your password to the SQL database, or they can update that. So basically, the co-owners of a flow are all able to open it and work on it. Okay. Note that when you share a flow with another user, you get this buyer beware that basically says you're adding another owner just like you. They will have full access to all connections in the flow. Okay, now also you can share connections. And then when you share connections, it's one of those things where if you don't share a connection, but you share an app and you haven't shared the connection, then that user will need their own connection and generally have to supply a password. However, you can share a connection, and when you share a connection, you can add it as the can edit or can use. And you can also add it to can use plus share. So there's lots of different things. But the idea is that everyone that kind of co-owns a connection can all use the same connection. So if you share the connection that gets to a SQL database with 10 other users, they can all piggyback off your same connection that has the exact same username and password. Okay. Now, also, there are application players. So note that someone can go to web.powerapps.com. So that's kind of where I've been running my demos from. And, one downside to that is that when a user gets here, especially if you have a user that has no intention to ever create anything, they're in a builder environment, which is kind of unfortunate. One extra thing that we could do is that if we take our app and we get the details, note that it's possible to take the web link. Now, let me go to this other user who now just kind of has run capabilities, and we provide that link to the user. So if we can serve up some kind of a web page inside here, and note that here my connection has failed. So now notice that because I did not share this connection, this user can't use the same connection. So now this user, is being prompted to basically create their own connection to SharePoint, to be able to, connect with their own identity inside there, as long as that user has the permissions to get there. Let's go ahead and choose allow. And what you're going to see now is kind of a new thing isn't set up. My camera is not set up. Okay, so this demo is not as smooth as I like. But the idea of the sharing, is the important part there. Okay, now you've seen that, so let's keep going through here. And the next thing we're going to talk about is app versioning. So when we modify our apps, what we're able to do is batch all our updates and basically publish them all at once. So if I have a app inside here, and so here are the details. If I look at the versions of my app, well, the first time you publish it to someone who has read-only capabilities, it gets a version number, and its version number is 1. Okay, so let's say that, at this point I take the app and we go into edit mode here, and I'll make just some type of a modest change to my app. Then we'll have another version of the app, that we're able to publish inside here. So inside of this, I'm not going to do all that much other than maybe we'll just go to the screen itself and we'll give it a better looking back color. And so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and save our changes. And now that we've saved our changes, we haven't made our changes live. But the idea is that I could publish my changes, and the act of publishing my changes is going to overwrite version 1 with version 2. Okay, now if we go back and we see all versions inside here, one of the things that you could see is now we've moved from version 1 to version 2. If there was a oopsie and all of a sudden version 2 is blowing up and version 1, while it didn't have the new features, was working fine, there's always the ability to click on the restore button. Now, it won't really put you back to version 1, but it will create version 3 over version 1. And note that I can't do that because I have it opened in PowerApps Studio inside here. As long as I close some of these down, I should be able to try one more time. And now it is restoring the app. And what you can see is that it now is version 3, but it is a copy of version 1. So we've kind of reverted back inside there. And then you can go ahead and test that version. So it's not live yet. People are still using version 2, but now once I publish this version, all of a sudden they upgrade to version 3, which is basically stepping back to version 1 inside there. And note that with versioning, that if I give you edit permissions, not just use permissions, you see exactly, where the application is. So if I open it today and I do 3 days of work, but I haven't published it, the people who run the app, see the latest published version, those that can enter, PowerApps Studio in edit mode, will see the most recent version regardless of what you last published inside there. Okay, let's get back to the slides. And that was basically how we can do versioning. Okay, so now over the next couple slides, we're going to look at how we can export and import Canvas apps. Now, I'll preface this section by saying, in the future, not too long, 6 months from now, this story will be much different and much better in the fact that you will be able to package up a whole bunch of Canvas apps and flows at once with a solution. Today it's kind of a one-off, where you have to export and import Canvas apps and flows one by one. And then for things like custom connectors, those are really tough because you have to, get the open API Swagger definitions to back them up. And then when you restore them, quite often you have to configure credentials and then give them 5 to 15 minutes before they actually start working. But the process is to, basically back up certain things. Some things we can export and then import, but we're looking to basically move things between environments. Now, one of the things that we have that's fairly new, it's still in preview, is the ability to create an export package for a Canvas app. Now, when we do this, note that you're going to create a package, and your package has to be created as either a create as new or an update existing. And the idea is that when you push an app out for the first time, and you might have something such as you are working in a dev environment and you have an app and you're ready, and so you back it up by exporting it, you move over to another environment, and then you import it to recreate it. So it's going to have dependencies. And so for things like a SQL database connection, what you'd have to do today is you have to go to the environment and create the database connection, set the password, and then afterwards you will import the package. So that's basically why we have a related resource and we configure it. If you look down there, you have the select during import. Okay. Now, when you do the export, you just basically get a zip archive inside there. And the zip archive is then something that you can import. So now if you go to another environment and you go to the apps view and you basically say import package, you're able to import that package. Now, once again, before you do the import, you have to make sure that there is a existing connection to that SQL database. And so as part of the import process, you can bring up a selection pane that allows you to pick the particular related resource inside there. And in our case, that related resource is going to be a connection to that wingtip sales database. Now, it's also possible to export a flow. So if you go to a flow, notice that we have an export, and it will back up to a zip archive if you want to import it, back into another tenant or another environment, as a flow. It's also possible to back it up in a JavaScript object notation format. So if you wanted to export it from Flow and import it into Azure Logic Apps, they give you that ability to do as well. Okay. Now, next thing we're going to look at is installing and configuring an on-premises data gateway. Let's go ahead and kind of talk at a high level about what a gateway does. So you have a PowerApps solution, and maybe you have a Canvas app, you have a Flow, you have some connections. The rub is that while everything about PowerApps runs in the cloud, the data that you're interested in, lives inside of a local area network with an Active Directory domain. And so there's no way that PowerApps, services in the cloud can reach, directly into your local network and connect directly to your SQL Server. And if PowerApps could do that, you probably need to get a new SQL administrator, who knows how to configure firewalls. I digress. But the idea of a gateway is that we're going to install some type of an agent. It runs as a service, and we're going to install it on, probably a server in the server room. Could be on any PC. So if the IT department is not involved, the accounting department or the marketing department could just install a PC and install the gateway on that. But the idea is that the gateway runs on a machine inside the local area network, and it can then access other resources such as that SQL Server database or the SharePoint farm. Now, Microsoft is very interested in allowing us to connect to this on-premise data, but do it in a very safe way. So when we use a on-premises gateway, what happens is you basically have to, on the computer that runs the gateway, log in using a account, and what that does is it creates a special connection with Azure Service Bus, back into the PowerApps cloud. Now, when this connection is made, note that the on-premises gateway makes outbound calls. So there are some firewalls you have to open, but I'd much rather open an output bound port than an input bound. So the only ports you have to open to get the Azure Service Bus connection or outbound ports. But the idea is that now when you create connections through a gateway, they can basically go through that Azure Service Bus connection, and it's more connection oriented than HTTP. So it's a TCP connection. So it's high performance. Also, it uses an encryption format. It's not SSL, which is with HTTP, but it's a TCP, spin on doing the same thing that SSL does. So it never crosses the wire in clear text. But the idea is that now we can have connections that don't have to have a long name. We can use a short server name because the name just has to be resolved within a local area network. Okay, so now what you see what the on-premises data gateway is, well, you can download the installation files. You need a target server to put it on. I'll also note that for large companies that don't want any downtime, the on-premises gateway, especially in Power BI and in PowerApps, can be a single point of failure. So they do have clustering now available where you can install it across a primary and then a failover machine. Okay, but here, let's say I just want to install it on a single machine. We have this series of dialogues that we answer. And the first one is that it asks you to choose between the on-premises data gateway and the personal gateway. We pick on-premises data gateway. We accept the licensing terms, we install the software, and then when we're done, we have to name the gateway and then also supply a recovery key. Now, the recovery key is interesting because the recovery key is going to be used to build an encryption key that takes your credentials and encrypts them before they're stored in the cloud. Now, you don't get to create the encryption key. You create the recovery key, and when you click on configure, they'll take your recovery key and use that to create the encryption key. Now, if for some reason you have a failure or you want to move the gateway from one machine to another, if you reinstall or reconfigure and you use the same recovery key, it creates the same encryption key, meaning it can encrypt things that are stored inside the cloud. Okay. Now, once you've basically installed and you've set the recovery key, you then log in, and that basically is the gateway reaching out to the Power BI cloud and setting up that Azure Service Bus connection. And you can basically go and monitor and see, hey, it's all ready for PowerApps and Flow. Now, here is just a quick call out to the gateways, ports. And if you have a gateway, note that it is often required that you open firewall ports because of the Azure Service Bus connection. So you can see firewall ports 5, 6, 7, 1, and 7, 2, and 9350 through 54 are what they use. So you'll basically get whoever controls the firewall to open those. Note that if you can't get the firewall opened, you can go back to the on-premises data gateway and you can configure it to run in HTTPS mode. So instead of using the Azure Service Bus connection, it falls back on HTTP. Therefore, it only runs through port 443. So it's not recommended unless you have to do that because it's not as performant. But for scenarios where you just can't open these ports to make the Azure Service Bus connection, that is at least an alternative. Note that if I have a gateway, and remember that today the on-premises gateway is only allowed in the default environment. And that's just a technical issue they have to work through. Nothing on purpose about that. I will think that 6 months to a year, all environments will be able to run an on-premises data gateway. But today, just remember that it has to only be the default environment. But you can see, once you have a gateway, when we are creating connections, we're able to take and specify, what the gateway is. And then also remember that, as you're using it and you put in your username and you put in your password, they're going to use the encryption key that's created from the recovery key to encrypt the data, and then they're going to store that in the cloud. But Microsoft nor any other party, has that encryption decryption key. It only resides on that data gateway. And so Microsoft can kind of, to some degree prove we don't have the ability to see what you've done. No one does. You're basically the owner of the key that's doing the encryption of your credentials, before storing it to the cloud. Okay, note that if I go back up to PowerApps Admin Center, I'm sorry, that's not the PowerApps Admin Center. Just in the regular web.powerapps.com, if I go down and I take a look at gateways, I can see the gateways. I have one that I've connected. Let's go ahead and open this gateway inside there. So we can specify, what users or what groups, are allowed to go through this particular gateway. And also you can see any connections that have already been created. And, there's some type of administration, edit, share, or delete, these particular connections through the gateway. Okay. So now you've seen the on-premises gateway, let's just reiterate, when is it required? It's required anytime you need to access, on-premises data. So the most common cases are local SQL Server, local Oracle, or other types of databases, local SharePoint farms, file shares, things like that. Okay, before we jump into the last section, I want to show you an interesting demo. So here I am at web.powerapps.com. Let's say that I go from here to the Admin Center. And you've already seen this a little bit earlier, and I can see my environments there. Great. Let me go over to Microsoft Flow. And Flow has a admin center that I can get to as well. So let's go to the admin center here. And let me now switch back and forth between the PowerApps admin center and the Flow admin center. And what you're going to see is that there's really no difference. It's the same admin center. Okay, now it really doesn't make sense to have two admin centers, even though two have come up. And as the Power Platform moves forward, what you're going to see is that there is a new admin center. So let me go ahead and move over here. So I've now moved over to admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. So today, this is just entered into preview. So notice that if I go down below here, they have Microsoft Flow. If I click on that, it basically just branches out to where we just were, basically the Flow Admin Center. And same thing if I go back here and I try to get to those same places for, let me get back here any second now. Once again, if I click on Power Apps or Power BI, it will just bring me to the admin portals for those. But eventually it won't be redirecting you out to those other portals. It will basically have the things that we need inside here. If I go and take a look at environments, I can see the different environments. Today, it's not showing you the environments without a CDS database. It's only showing you the environments with a CDS database. But if I am to go to one of these particular environments right here, notice that it's going to give me a lot more detail about the environments. So as far as, having analytics about the different applications and flows that you've run, that's going to be available here. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of show this new Power Platform admin console so you have an idea what it is. You can go test it out. And I think you'll see that eventually more and more functionality will be added inside here. And by the middle of next year, this could be the primary admin center that we use, for everything we do with PowerApps Flow and CDS for apps. Okay, in our last section, we're going to cover packaging and deploying solutions. And that begs the question is, what is a solution? Before we get into that, let's talk about some of the basic principles of application lifecycle management. So let's say that you're creating something with PowerApps or Flow or the CDS for apps. So the idea of application lifecycle management is that when you create customizations or custom applications, that you have some type of an asset that you can check into a source code system, such as, Visual Studio Online or GitHub. So you want to have a set of files, that basically define your development efforts. You don't want to have to rely on any running instance of an environment which runs the CDS or doesn't run the CDS. So once you check things into source code control, then you could start using branches for release management. And also we can start viewing and approving changes at a very granular level. One of the issues that you're going to see as you export apps and when you export solutions, you get one big zip archive. And there could be 1,000 different things that might have changed or might not have changed, inside the definition of that zip archive. So being able to kind of get down to a more granular level gets to be important. Now, another important thing is you want to have developer isolation. So if you have 3 or 4 people who are building out solutions, each one having their own environment and not letting, one developer step on something that another developer is doing is important. And then finally, we want the full automation of application lifecycle management procedures. So luckily there's PowerShell that we have, so I can do things like export a solution from environment A and import it into environment B. And once again, you're not having to do things by hand, but you have the ability to either script things out with PowerShell or use some of the application lifecycle management connectors that are new inside of Flow and PowerApps. Now, let's introduce this notion of a solution. So the idea of a solution is that you want to be able to record and basically create the definition of everything you've done in an environment. So for instance, you've created custom entities, you've customized existing entities, you've created one or more model-driven apps. So the idea is that when you create a solution, you're backing up this metadata so that you could do your dev work in environment 1, you can export to a solution, and then you can move over to environment 2 production and import your solution. Now note that it's just meant to move the metadata, your development efforts. Solutions are not used to move the business data itself. And the idea is that as you push out a solution into a production environment and you get business data, when you make changes you want to go back to your dev environment, make the changes, create a upgraded version of your solution and push it back in to the production environment, but you want the business data to stay where it is in place. Now, solutions can be managed or unmanaged. This takes a little bit of time to really get your head around, but let's start basic. If something is unmanaged, it's an open solution, which means you can make changes. So we haven't been dealing with anything to do with managed solutions, because when you have a managed solution, you're able to import it and all its components are locked down. It's kind of like you're installing software from an independent software vendor. And the idea is that you can't freely go ahead and change things in a pre-built application. Now, as you're doing your development work, you can't work on a managed solution. It has to be unmanaged so you can basically make changes. But the idea is that after you're done with a set of development customizations, inside of a development environment, you can export the solution. And when you export the solution, you can export it as either a managed solution or an unmanaged solution. So if I export it as a managed solution, then I could basically import it or install it, into another environment, and my apps and flows show up, but no one can change them. They're locked down. Now, you can also export something as unmanaged, and then when you import it, you get all the same things. It's just they're not locked down, so you continue to work on it. So typically, the more you're structured like an independent software vendor, the more you want to ship managed solutions that the users or the administrators at the company where we're installing it can't fiddle around with it. We want it locked down. Other times, we just want to move our development efforts from environment 1 to 2, but then continue to work on them. So we'll export as an unmanaged solution. Now, the other thing is, if you really want to keep your changes in source code so that you're not reliant on any living, running CDS instance, well, you export as an unmanaged solution, you put that into source control, then you could basically always get back and import it into a new environment to kind of get your development efforts back that you can continue to work on. Now, once again, when you import a managed solution, it's locked down. You cannot modify it or remove any application components or customizations. So one of the big advantages is that once we go with a managed solution, it's serviceable and upgradable. Now, if you work in a dev environment and you create a custom entity and then you build a model-driven app on top, if we then export it as a managed solution and we import it into the production environment, what you'll find is that you can't make any changes to it in the production environment. However, you can go back to the development environment, make your changes, because it's still an unmanaged solution back there, and then the idea is you build a second version of your managed solution package, and then what happens is you get a much more predictable way to either upgrade or update components. And then also, when you install a managed solution, and then later you uninstall it, everything that was installed is uninstalled. And that's not the case with an unmanaged solution. So when you install an unmanaged solution, it basically is like toothpaste out of a tube where it pushes things into your environment. And if you want to install the apps and flows, you're going to have to today delete them one by one. Okay. Now, another thing that's important is that solutions are layered. So what that means is, let's say that we have a solution maybe from Microsoft. If you start working with Dynamics 365, they have lots of different solutions that they will install. And the idea is that you have this layer of managed solutions. And if you have two managed solutions and one customizes the built-in contact entity one way and the other customizes it a second way, you have something where the solution that is on top, so we have layers, whoever's on top wins. And then also, you can also think about, you can always go to an environment and create a new app or flow on the fly. So you have this unmanaged layer, which is always on top. So your unmanaged layer can always, override one of the managed solutions that you have installed. And once again, this gets to be a lot more work to get this right, but there's a lot more predictability in how we push out something into deployment and we upgrade over time. Okay. Now, the UI is not very well put together for Power Apps yet. You have to go into the older Dynamics 365 to create a solution today. But as you go in and you decide you want to create a solution, you can either create a solution for everything, all assets, or you can pick individual assets. So for instance, if in your dev environment you have 3 different custom entities you've created, but you want your solution to only contain one of them, you can pick exactly what you want. As it builds the export package, it will basically just include what you want. And because the CDS has so many, different entities and there's so many different things, creating a segmented solution is going to be much faster to do the export and import when you're just having to, layer small pieces. One of the other issues is that if you have 2 solutions and you install solution 1 and it does something to the contact, which is the out-of-the-box entity, and then your solution does nothing and you install your solution on top, it could cover up customizations from something down below. So if you're not doing anything to the contact entity type, you should not include that with your solution because you don't want to cover up other things, that might be making those changes. Okay, now here's the big benefit of managed solutions. So certainly the fact that they're locked down means you have to go back to the dev environment, make changes, and build a new version of a solution package. But the big benefits are your ability to, have very granular updates or upgrades. Now, if all I need to do is quickly fix a form behind a custom entity, what you're able to do is you're able to build an solution export, which is just a update. And the idea is that you could go and run it in the production environment, and it's going to replace, any of the existing components or UI pieces, in the same layer. If you remove a component and you do an update, it's not going to remove that component. So all the unused components remain in the system. When you have an update, you also have a choice of whether to overwrite any of the unmanaged customizations that went on top or to keep them. And typically, we probably want to overwrite them just to make sure we get back to our base state. Now, there's also a patch. So you can also create managed solution packages that just apply patches, to create specific fixes or updates. Now, this is additive only, so once again, there's not going to be any deletes. But what's important is that layers on top of the parent solution, it does not impact any of the layers above, and we'll see a graphic of that in just a second. Now, finally, there's upgrade. So upgrade is where you're doing a fairly big release of a solution. And the idea of an upgrade is you can roll up a bunch of patches. So if you applied 3 or 4 different patches, your upgrade can basically take all those patches. Your upgrade also has the ability to remove components you don't need anymore. And there's also a place that you can run arbitrary upgrade logic. For instance, you have a new column you're adding to a custom entity, but you already have 1,000 rows in the database, and when you add that custom column, they're all going to be blank fields. So you can add the logic to go and set what the default value of each one should be. Okay, now if I add patches, notice that here we have solution A, B, and C, and you kind of see that they're layered together. So when we add patches, they're always applied right on top of the solution that they're targeted for, underneath any type of solution that would be over top. And the idea is we don't want anything from solution A masking solution B or C, since solution B and C are on top in the solution package layers. Okay, now another very nice piece of the story is something which is called Solution Packager. So when you build a solution package, you basically just got a zip archive. So you can imagine that if you check the zip archive into source control, what do you really have? You have a single file. Well, here's a new version of the zip archive. There's 1,000 things that could have changed, and we can't really tell when we just have a new version. So the idea of the Solution Packager is to take that zip archive and to basically expand it out into individual files. So when we do look in source control, now we can see individual files. And so if I want to see the difference, what's changed? When you're using different source control systems like Visual Studio online, or you're using some other differencing software, being able to look at a folder structure and find out what files have changed. And for instance, you'll find one file that's just particular to the custom entity that you've just made a small customization change to. So the solution packager takes the zip archive and expands it so you can put it into source control. And then you could basically make changes and approve certain files inside. But then the solution packager, when you're done, also allows you to take what's currently approved and to bundle it up into a solution package that now we can install. But it just gives you a lot more granularity and visibility into what you're doing with each release of a solution package. Now, when it comes time to install solutions, well, there's a full PowerShell story that we have. Note that when you create a solution, your solution could depend on another solution. So I'm sure many independent software vendors will start building solutions on top of the solutions that come with Dynamics 365. And the idea is, if you go to an environment and you try to install a solution and one of the dependent solutions is not yet installed, it's going to get an error and tell you need to install the dependent solutions. And after you've done that, well, now you can finally install the solution that depends on those other solutions you've just installed. Now, there is a solution manager that you can use. And the solution manager, we'll see that in just a second, a UI. There's also a package deployer tool. And the package deployer tool can be run interactively. You can automate it, running it from PowerShell. So once again, the whole idea of building out a solution, inside of your dev environment, running PowerShell to create the export package, and then basically putting it into source control, and then being able to make granular changes, rebuild the package from what's approved in source control, and then to deploy it, gets to be something where everything, once again, can be automated. Certain software vendors, will also be creating solutions and adding them into App Source Marketplace. So if you install a solution from App Source Marketplace, it's going to run the package deployer tool, to actually do the installation. A couple more details. When you import an unmanaged solution, it's very different than when you import a managed solution. Remember, the managed solution is from an independent software vendor or someone who's done a lot of extra work, to give you a much better install, update, and delete story. When you install a managed solution and then later you uninstall it, everything gets deleted. However, when you import an unmanaged solution, remember, you can still make changes, so you have an unmanaged layer that's already there. So let's say I create a Canvas app today, and then tomorrow we import an unmanaged solution that adds another Canvas app. So those two things are just merged together in the unmanaged layer. And you can't really tell that the second Canvas app came from an unmanaged solution. It's just a way to kind of push things in. So merge changes, you can't remove all the things that your unmanaged solution put in. You'd have to go and remove them by hand. The other thing is, once you install an unmanaged solution, it doesn't automatically publish your changes. So for instance, if you install an unmanaged solution and an app is available, you're then going to have to go and publish the app to make it available to certain users within the organization. Okay. And that's what takes us to the end. So this last session, a little bit futuristic, but hopefully it gives you an idea of packaging as solutions. And even though today PowerApps or Canvas apps and flows are not supported by solutions, they will be over the next couple months. And then they will be the recommended way that we do advanced application lifecycle management with PowerApps and Flow.